how this came about is a few years ago I came across this book called Smokescreen, which is interesting for a law enforcement officer to buy it, but you know, for those of you who may not recognize the cover is just covered with marijuana leaves. After reading it, I kind of on a whim sent an email to Kevin Sabet and asked him if he would come speak. And I got an email back from him relatively quick and advising me that he would come, but he did mention that Jamestown was interesting to him because of the 10,000 Maniacs. So 10,000 Maniacs happens to be his favorite band, and so we lured him this way. It's been about 2.5 years in the making. What really appealed to me with Kevin in the book, I've been on record saying that I was against the legalization of marijuana. And a lot of my information was more anecdotal, you know, what I saw out in the field, what I witnessed. I had not done the research, you know, and what we get from Kevin is years of research. What you'll hear is that he's worked for Republican and Democratic presidential administrations as a drug policy advisor. Without any further ado, I introduce Kevin Sabet.
New York made a choice, not a choice I supported, in fact a choice we stopped for 5 years in a row and then couldn't do it for a 6th year in a row when the politics completely changed really overnight almost because of lots of things going on in people's political careers. And so the politics changed on this, and obviously New York has legalized marijuana. But most of the county, the majority of the county, of the towns and villages, cities here in Chautauqua County, of course, have voted against the sales of it. And the majority of counties and towns generally in New York have done that. And that's very typical of states. States will vote for it, or their legislators will vote in favor. But then when it comes to your own backyard, most people don't want it. You know, most people don't go to their realtor and say, I want to, buy a house in a place with a, whether it's liquor store, pot dispensary, payday loans. That's not usually something people want. And so that's why it's not super surprising that we've seen kind of that local pushback. But what I wanted to do today is kind of go through really the latest data and the myths that are out there around this issue. Obviously it's a very misunderstood issue. I'm also going to talk a little bit about other drugs too, because obviously we're in an unprecedented addiction, overdose, death crisis driven by fentanyl in a way that we've never had before. We've had many epidemics of heroin in our history of the United States, 3 of them about, but never anything as deadly as we're seeing. And that's because fentanyl has changed the name of the game, and now we have other similar drugs that are even scarier because they do not respond to Narcan, the overdose prevention antidote, that you spray. And the reason, is because these are just unprecedented drugs for they're not meant for human consumption, and we still haven't figured out how to, and they might figure out how to reverse some of them, but really it's a game of cat and mouse, and we have to really get to the bottom of these issues, and I'll talk about some solutions maybe at the end as well, and please do write down questions that you might have. Just generally, we should remember that substance use and addiction are leading causes of preventable death in this country. They represent our largest and most costly public health and medical problem. There is no other medical problem as costly as addiction. And addiction, of course, doesn't just mean illegal drugs. Addiction, actually, the majority of the costs come from the drugs that are legally available. And that's not because those drugs happen to be more lethal. It's actually because when you make something more legally available and normalized and commercialized, that in and of itself raises the dangerousness of the drug to society. So I'll give you a quick example. If somebody had in front of you a cigarette and a vial of heroin, and they said, you have to use one of these 2 things, which would you choose? Well, a rational decision would be to choose the cigarette, because we know we may not like the smell or whatever, but it's kind of a nuisance. We're not going to overdose on that cigarette and die, and there's a chance we could do that with heroin. So obviously we would say, well, the heroin is much more harmful, so I'm going to take the cigarette. And that's true from a micro point of view. From a macro point of view, the cigarette has been far more harmful to humans than heroin ever was, and far more deadly. And that's partly because we have commercialized, legalized, and normalized tobacco consumption. And we still, with the smoking levels that are just dropped dramatically, we still have 400,000 people dying a year from smoking-related causes, because it doesn't just happen overnight. It takes time. Alcohol is another legal drug that I don't want to prohibit, but we have to be realistic and just kind of honest about the costs of alcohol and our alcohol habit. Our alcohol habit is the #1 reason why anybody gets arrested in this country for any drug. It's alcohol. There are more arrests for alcohol than crack, meth, heroin, fentanyl, marijuana combined. And you might be thinking, how are there arrests for alcohol? It's legal. What do you mean arrests? Well, it's not legal to be publicly intoxicated, usually. It's not legal to sell to minors, and it's not legal to drive drunk. If you do any of those 3 things, that's an alcohol-related violation. And I'm not even talking about the violence-related or the domestic assaults, etc. Put that aside for a minute. That's kind of indirect. But the direct alcohol arrests are double the number of other drugs. So it's a price that we pay, but we're not going to prohibit it, because alcohol, it's been around Western civilization for 5,000 years, used by the majority of Western civilization for that long. So you can't go back in time. We're stuck with it. It's kind of an accident of history, but there is not one cop I've met, not one mother I've met, not one teacher I've met who've said, our family, our classroom, or our citizens would be better off if more of them drank. Right? You've never heard that before. So it's not because it's good for you. It's because despite it being bad for you, we've kind of made that deal. But that deal is very costly, and we should be honest about those costs. Not only socially, economically. For every dollar in tax revenue for alcohol, we spend about 15 in social costs. So we pay a very dear cost for that. And then our third legal drug, don't forget about the third class, which are what are they? Prescription opioids. Prescription opioids drove the opioid epidemic of the last decade. They're part of the reason we're in the mess we are now with fentanyl and opioids. And that's a class of legal drugs as well, perfectly legal with a prescription. And we thought we were being smart. The gatekeeper of that were very smart people, doctors. You can't get sort of the highest level of society, doctors. And yet here we are with the remnants of that opioid problem, which has killed, in the last decade, almost 600, 700,000 people, and hit certain communities even harder. And so we're left with that as well. So the dangerousness of drugs, part of it is its legal status, not just its pharmacological properties. And again, that isn't even to talk about the consequences that they have, not only to the individual, but to things like lost productivity at work, child neglect, abuse, family dysfunction, etc. Drug problems have no easy answers, so anything that's presented on a bumper sticker, like legalize or whatever, or the other extreme, incarcerate everybody, usually is not the right answer, because it's a very complex issue. Addiction is a disease. It's not a moral failing. It's a brain disease. It's a complex biobehavioral brain disease, disorder. And, unlike other brain diseases, like let's take Alzheimer's, for example, addiction actually does respond to incentives, both positive and negative. It's interesting because other brain disease don't do that. So for example, if you know anyone with Alzheimer's, you can't say to them, if you don't remember my name tomorrow, I'm going to put you in jail for a month. That's not going to make them remember your name, or the opposite. I'll give you $1 million if you remember my name and buy you a new house. That's not going to be motivating for them that's a brain disease they have at some point very little control over if it's not properly controlled. Addiction is a little bit different. Although, addiction does hijack the brain, and obviously there's a range of kind of, not every addiction is the same, not every disorder is the exact same. So there's a range, but a lot of people do respond to incentives in addiction, which is very interesting. So, why did George Bush become president? He stopped drinking. He was a major alcoholic at one point. Why did he stop? He didn't go to treatment. He didn't pay some huge amount. He could have afforded it at a fancy treatment center. His wife said, I'm going to kick you out of the house if you don't stop drinking. That was a powerful enough incentive for him to stop drinking. In fact, the majority of people who stop using drugs or alcohol in this country actually don't go through formal treatment. There's some external thing. They have a family and they realize they can't do this anymore. I have a wife and kid, and I can't do it anymore. Or they're going to lose their job, or they're going to be kicked out of housing. And actually what that speaks to is, things like drug treatment courts, of which I believe there are some here, or at least one in the county. A drug court is where you give someone an incentive and you say, listen, if you don't, you won't go to jail for your drug use, but that's on the condition that you go to treatment. And if this was a total powerless disease, that wouldn't work. It would be like Alzheimer's, the example. It wouldn't work. But in 60 to 70% of the cases, that does work. It motivates people to get help. So the point of me saying this is that this is a complex disease. It's not something that responds to just only one answer. And that's why I worry if we think we're going to solve the addiction crisis by simply reviving people with Narcan every day and think that we're going to somehow get out of it. That's one little aspect of it, and we should do it, but that's a little Band-Aid. That's one little Band-Aid. That's not gonna get to the root of the disease. It's a Band-Aid. Band-Aids are needed when you're bleeding. We're definitely bleeding as a country on this. We need the Band-Aids, but we need more than Band-Aids. And we need to understand that it really does take a comprehensive approach. So I left the Obama administration in 2011, and part of the reason was to start SAM. SAM was founded by myself, and we got one high-profile Democrat, one high-profile Republican. The high-profile Democrat is Patrick Kennedy, Ted Kennedy's son, who is the congressman from Rhode Island, who's in addiction recovery himself, who called me as soon as Colorado legalized marijuana 11 years ago and said, this is going to be terrible for people in recovery because there are 23 million Americans in recovery today. And the idea that we're now going to be bombarded with, we already have alcohol, we already have tobacco, prescription, now we're going to be bombarded with marijuana, really was a frightening prospect. So we started this to really raise more information raise the profile about this issue and talk about it in a balanced way. I don't want to throw anybody in prison for marijuana use. We don't want to be giving people criminal records so they can't, get housing, health care, etc. But at the same time, we want to not go to the other extreme, which I think we're very close to, I have to say, right now in society and in the state, of completely normalizing and promoting it. I mean, the state is spending money as we speak to promote people to buy marijuana because most people are still buying it from the illegal market, which we've said that would of course happen. The illegal market does not go away when you legalize. In fact, it expands when you legalize it. Just like gambling, by the way. When gambling's legalized, underground gambling doesn't go away. It gets bigger. The demand for the activity goes up. The state cannot fill that void, and the illegal market thrives, and it thrives because it doesn't pay taxes, it has no regulations, it has no hours of operation, and it sells to whoever wants it. So there are a lot of reasons why that illegal market's going to stay, and so I worry that we're really at this point where the best we can do is put out ads on social media saying for people to buy legal marijuana from their New York State retailer. I mean, if that's not paired with messages that talk about the impaired driving issue, marijuana doubles your risk of a car crash. The issue of mental health, and I'm going to get into that data today, IQ, all these things that have come up, that's, to me, that's not being responsible with it at all. Now, you might be thinking, it's just marijuana, why are we talking about it? Well, I want you to make a division in your mind between new marijuana and old marijuana. If you're thinking about Woodstock or really anything older than 10 years, it doesn't have to go back to Woodstock, you're thinking about old marijuana. You're thinking about medium to low level amounts of THC. THC is the active ingredient in marijuana. That's what gets you high. Marijuana has many, many ingredients in it, many components in it. It's a very complex plant, actually, much more complex than, say, the opium plant or the coca leaf, and which also makes it exciting for research, which I'm very much in favor of, to research. But I'm not talking about the old joints. I'm really talking about the new products, the edibles, the ice creams, the candies, the sodas, the alcohol infused, THC infused alcohol, the gummies, the hash oils, which are causing so many more explosions that the state of California is now spending millions of dollars with their environmental and hazardous waste enforcement teams to dismantle not only fentanyl and meth labs, but labs that produce hash oil because it's with highly flammable like butane and other chemicals that are very, very dangerous. And so to them, it's right up there with fentanyl in terms of the danger to the community environmentally. But we're talking about this stuff. And if you show anybody who last smoked marijuana, at a Grateful Dead concert or maybe a 10,000 Maniacs concert, I guarantee you it wasn't this. And we're talking, it's really a whole new ball game. And so this is new marijuana. And I don't call it cannabis because cannabis is the plant, the genus name from the plant that was thousands of years ago that totally had very different levels of THC. But see, we've become much better farmers and much better at agriculture. We've learned to genetically breed this plant in very specific ways. The specific way is to breed it so that we can increase the THC, and that's the point. And when you got to take a blowtorch and put a sticky brown substance on the end of a hot needle, we're talking about a whole new ball game, which is not the old marijuana at all. And whether you can listen to a Republican Surgeon General, maybe we have some Republicans in the room, whether you want to listen to a Republican or whether you're a Democrat. This is not controversial, what I'm saying. And this is, by the way, the Surgeon General in the Trump administration, Jerome Adams, the Surgeon General in the Obama administration, Vivek Murthy, and fast forward, he's also the Surgeon General in the Biden administration. He got his old job back. And all of them are sharing the same concern that I have, which is that we have given this perception that it's harmless, then the data tells us otherwise. The data tells us that there is addiction. Addiction to marijuana is real. I remember being at a school once and a kid raising his hand saying, "Kevin, you're wrong. No, there's no such thing as marijuana addiction." And I said, "Well, how do you know that there's no such thing?" He said, "I know there's no such thing as marijuana addiction because I use marijuana every single day." So that tells you where we are as a country on this, and the mental health issue. And it's not only that we have more new users of marijuana. The actual worry to me is that even among existing users, the consumption levels have gone from once a month to like every day. And what I mean by that is if you look at this chart, blue and red, blue is marijuana, red is alcohol. This is the percentage of the past month users. So of everybody who said, "Yeah, I tried it, I used it in the last 30 days. Of that group, this is the percentage of those people who actually use it almost every day. And alcohol and marijuana used to track very similar. And then basically starting really with the medical marijuana movement in the mid-90s, we started having this big divide, meaning more than half, and the data is falling off of 2015, so it actually goes to later than that, but you can't see it. More than half of people who have used it at least once in the last month actually use it every day. And alcohol has stayed steady. It's only about 10% of drinkers drink every day. So we're talking about something else. Another way to think about it I like is, if you think about caffeine consumption, the typical marijuana user was consuming the amount of caffeine, for example, for their THC, found in one 20-ounce, like a bottle of Coke that you get at the gas station. And that was the typical marijuana user 20 years ago. The typical marijuana user today is consuming the equivalent, if you think about the caffeine example, of 33 grande Starbucks cappuccinos. So it's a completely different order of magnitude in terms of the amount the typical user is using. So again, I don't care if you're an adult smoking a joint on your farm or you're like at a Willie Nelson concert, or we're talking about concerts and things like that. That's not the issue for me. The issue is about the regular user, the user under 25, whose brain is being affected by this, because your brain is pruning and priming and forming up until about age 25, 28, maybe 30 at the very latest. And your brain is vulnerable during that time. And so, 90-some% of people with an addiction started having their drug use before they were age 21. The good news part of that is if you can get your kids up to 21 to never use or drink, they're unlikely ever to have a drug or alcohol problem. So this is something that starts early. even those who were overprescribed pain medication, like I was. I dislocated my shoulder 23 years ago, and I was given a bottle of 100 OxyContins. The vast majority of people overprescribed something like Oxy did not have an addiction. They did not use, they were like me. They tried it once, didn't like it, and threw it away or gave it back or whatever. But we had a huge crisis with that. Well, who was that among? That was among people, most people who overused their overprescribed drugs. These people had an addiction beforehand to something else. These people had a history of drinking too much or using something. So my point in saying this is that you got to get through those teen years, got to get through up until or even young adult years. And we know that because your brain is vulnerable. Also, your brain is vulnerable in a good way when you're young. I mean, that's how you learn to be good at sports. You usually don't learn to be good at sports if you try after you're age 30, with the exception of some sports. But if you're like a master at an instrument, you're starting before 30. If you speak multiple languages, you probably learned them before you were 30. It's not impossible to learn a new language after 30. People do it all the time. And I encourage that. And it's good for your brain, actually, to do that. But it's much harder. Frankly, one of the reasons it's good for your brain is it's a very difficult exercise. And that's part of the reason why it's good for your brain as you get older to learn more languages. In fact, they think the more languages you learn, you can protect yourself from things like dementia and things like that. But the point is that marijuana, the THC in marijuana, binds to these different receptors in the brain that are responsible for movement, sensation, vision, coordination, judgment, reward, and memory. And reward and memory is the addiction center of the brain, because addiction is essentially you're being rewarded. It feels great. I mean, that's why people use drugs. They feel good. And so it feels good. Your reward is, high, very high reward, way more than anything you can get naturally. That's why people do it. Like if you look at the reward charts and you take natural highs like sex, good food, a trip, meeting someone new, something that really elevates you, and then you compare that to a substance that you like, there's no comparison. That's why addiction is so alluring. But memory, also you remember that you like it. So that's why you do things that you would not normally do to feed that addiction. Often, because you remember that you liked it and you keep going back to it. That's what's tough about it. That's what's so difficult. And we know that marijuana's active ingredient, THC, binds to the receptors in the brain and, by the way, throughout your body as well, that you have them. So what are we seeing? Well, we're seeing a couple different things right now. First of all, youth marijuana addiction is more than double that of alcohol and other substance use disorders, which is kind of surprising. What this means is that, for example, if you used marijuana more than 36 months in your teenage years, 20% of those people are actually addicted to marijuana versus 11% of those who smoked more than 3 years in their teenage, 12 to 17, and 9% for alcohol. The alcohol and cigarette numbers are about right. I mean, that's usually what because cigarettes, tobacco, nicotine was always the most addictive. But it's shocking to see these numbers for marijuana. This is a totally different kind of marijuana, and this proves it. Because this chart would not have looked like this 30 years ago. I guarantee you that. We were not seeing these rates of addiction at all. In fact, what we know now is 1 in 3 people over 12 years old, period, who have used in the last year actually fulfill the criteria for what we call a cannabis use disorder. That's the technical term for marijuana addiction. And we know that because you don't just ask somebody, are you addicted to this? You can ask them that, but you also ask them a battery of questions that actually reveal whether they're addicted or not. So it's really interesting because about 1 in 10 people admit that they're addicted to something, but 1 in 3 is the real number. So it shows that denial is a huge part of addiction as well, and it is. In the individual, the family, and society, it's all about denial for many reasons. The stigma associated with addiction and with people with substance use disorders, the denial that society has as we promote left and right legal drugs like alcohol and vapes and prescriptions and now marijuana and tomorrow hallucinogens and psychedelics. This is unfortunately in our culture. And so when you ask people, though, does it interfere with work? Do you spend a lot of money on it? Do you wake up thinking about it? Do you have preoccupied thoughts? Does it interrupt your sleep? I mean, you can ask people 10 to 15 questions and you know the level of their substance use disorder. And when you ask them those questions, 1 in 3 fulfill that technical DSM-5, what we call criteria for what we call cannabis use disorder. Among kids, the prevalence of marijuana use disorder has increased under legalization. That's not surprising. When we look at states that have legalized before New York, we see significant increases in youth marijuana use. And my real concern, because you might be thinking, well, so what? I mean, you had people in the 70s, and it's true. There was a period in the 70s where, 1 in 3 high school seniors was using marijuana every day. I mean, there was a time really in the 1970s where it was very normalized as well. But we did not see the negative consequences then like we do now. And I think it's because, a couple of reasons, mainly because it's new marijuana. It's very, very different. And so now we're seeing very startling things like a 5-time, which is a lot. I mean, it's sort of hard to wrap your brain. What does that mean, 5 times more? But it's a lot. 5 times more likely to develop psychosis than a non-user. This is an English study and these were people smoking 15% THC, which, yeah, that's a high amount for 10 years ago, but that's not a large amount now. But even just 15%, 5 times more likely. Lower potent marijuana, you were still 3 times more likely to develop psychosis. We've never seen numbers like this before. 2 times more likely to develop an anxiety disorder. That was a survey of 1,100 24-year-olds who reported recent use. Twice as likely to have abused other substances in the past year. So addiction is not usually about one substance. This is key also. It's polysubstance use. It's multiple substances. So people said, oh, well, we'll legalize marijuana so people drink less, and that's good because drinking makes you violent and marijuana makes you chill. So that's a good trade-off. If only it were that easy. First of all, marijuana these days does not make you chill. That's kind of the scary part about it. But the other part of it is that these are substances that are often used together. And in every state that's legalized marijuana, the sales of alcohol have gone up, not down. And when you look at the individual behavior, it's also the same thing. You're also much more likely to be a tobacco user, which is pretty interesting as well. But what's also concerning, I think, when you look at, especially, you talk a lot about economic, we've been talking today, we were in Jamestown earlier, about sort of economic future and competitiveness and the 21st century economy and America's place in this very high-tech, very competitive world. And when you look at what we're seeing marijuana doing to high school completion, so if you use even low intensity of use, but certainly medium to high, which sadly is becoming so much more common, you show much higher dropout rates than non-users, much lower university entrance exams than non-users. And the big one was the big study from about 10 years ago, which has been replicated numerous times on 1,037 people born in 1972 and who were tested for their IQ between age 13 and 38. And then they were tested for marijuana. They found that regular marijuana use in adolescence was associated with an 8-point drop in IQ. An 8-point drop in IQ is enough to make you from an average student to a below average student. It's over $1 million of lost income in your lifetime. It's a very different life, actually, in some ways, in many ways. And that's a big deal when we think about, I think, the future and young people. We have a lot of people, especially since the pandemic, but also since the wars of the past few decades, who have PTSD, who are suffering from all kinds of stressors. And, 20 years ago, they used to put the cancer patient on TV and say, we need marijuana for medicine. Now it's the veterans. They say, well, we need marijuana for PTSD or to give to veterans or other people with PTSD. And so there was a huge review of studies and veterans and marijuana. And they basically said, first of all, the ones that have claimed any therapeutic use, there are very few of them and they're not good studies. But if anything, we have negative outcomes on other substance abuse, developing and worsening of psychiatric disorders, and self-harm and suicidality. And so what we're seeing with people, especially vulnerable populations, is that it's true that in a lot of people it takes kind of the edge off. You lower your anxiety in the short term, and you hear that from users. You hear I can cope with life a little bit better. Well, first of all, if they're using any drug to cope with life better, that's a bad sign. I don't care what it is, number one. But number two, the worst part about it is it might make you feel better in the short term, but we're seeing big negative outcomes in the long term. So it's having the reverse effect in the long term, and I think that's what we're seeing with some of these veteran studies. We have so much, it's a suicide epidemic among young people, self-harm. Sadly, marijuana is a risk marker, according to the Journal of the American Medical Association. Cannabis use disorder among kids with mood disorders is a risk marker for self-harm, any cause of death, including unintentional overdose, even homicide, which is like, whoa. In fact, really interesting, I don't talk about this a lot. I didn't even mention this earlier today, but looking at this slide, obviously there are many causes. I'm certainly not saying marijuana is the cause, but when you look at almost every single mass shooter in the last 5 to 10 years, dating back from, I was in Boston, we were in Cambridge, Massachusetts, when the marathon bomber was on the loose. We were all sheltering in place. It was a very scary time. They ended up living down the street, actually, him and his brother, from where we were, which was crazy, right down the street from Harvard University. But since then, and Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the brother, the younger brother, basically revealed heavy marijuana use. And then I'm telling you, you go to the vast majority, not all, but the vast majority, Uvalde, the Pulse nightclub, on and on and on of the mass shooters, the Colorado shootings. And one common denominator, and there are many, one common denominator is marijuana. I'm not saying that's the cause of it, but I'm saying that what we're seeing is a level of like the psychosis that precipitates violence that we've never seen before. And I think that is the mechanism. It's the psychosis that then is causing the violence, but the psychosis is being oftentimes precipitated by heavy marijuana use. It's very interesting because it totally is counter to the 60s and 70s experience and narrative of, I mean, the stoners were the quiet people who fell asleep and were really chill and like kind of, we're seeing a very different sort of demographic today. You know, I've also heard, well, at least maybe if it doesn't substitute for alcohol, maybe it can substitute for opioids. If you have some pain, take marijuana, not opioids. And again, in theory, that does sound good. I'd much rather have somebody, you know, use a little bit of marijuana than take a lot of opioids and risk an immediate death. If it was right in front of you, you got to smoke this whole joint or down 50 oxys. Even I would say smoke the joint. You know, but the reality is, study after study is actually showing that, again, these drugs are used together. And if anything, especially in young people, marijuana is triggering the use of opioids because it's not enough. They don't, you know, when you're addicted to something, if you're trying to recover, so this was a study, by the way, among those who were already addicted to opiates. And basically, when they were using marijuana instead, it actually made them want to use opiates again. And so it wasn't acting as a substitute, it was actually acting as a way for them to relapse on opiates. Because, and there are some reasons, but they're all, you can read these comments, but basically this idea that it just, THC wasn't doing the trick anymore. You wanted something better. And so that's why you had the desire to go back to your opiate use. And there have been study after study showing that there's twice the risk of opioid use on the days that marijuana is used. A Canadian study saying basically the same thing. It did not reduce opioid use during treatment or lead to people staying in treatment. It actually prompted the need for more anesthesia during surgery and all kinds of things. But really one of the central themes from this that I'm talking about is this idea of industry capture. So you can believe what you want or not about the studies that I just talked about, but one thing that is undeniable is that we are not talking about this sort of hippie movement to legalize marijuana, which is what it was in the 60s. It was the counterculture. I mean, I went to Berkeley, so I saw some of that. I went to Berkeley not in the 60s, but I saw the history. And the history was the counterculture, right? This was like sticking it to the man. This was like our way to get back at our parents and Richard Nixon. I mean, that was a lot of it, right? Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But the drivers now for the normalization of marijuana, quite ironically, actually, if you think about how anti-corporate that movement in the 60s was. I mean, they hated corporations. They were going against the grain, against the mainstream. There's a reason why it's called counterculture. They were going against the culture. They weren't with the culture. Now it's completely the opposite. Now the leaders of the marijuana movement, the ones funding all of this, funded the effort in New York, almost 99%, and funding other efforts. It's the opposite. These are people that look like me. These are people in suits who went to Ivy League schools and are trained in Wall Street and want to make money. It is about money. It is about the combination of capitalism and addiction. And you put those two things together, and it usually doesn't end well. You know, going back to tobacco as an example, tobacco has been used for thousands of years. When did people start dying? People started dying after the invention of one thing, the cigarette. The cigarette was invented in the Industrial Revolution. We learned that you could actually pre-package, pre-roll, put carcinogens in it and the tobacco leaf and other things and formaldehyde and all kinds of junk, mix it all together in a very convenient little stick called a cigarette that could be mass produced by our new machinery. And that's when, well, I mean, not immediately, it took 30, 40 years, but that's when we started to see the body count. Even though we've had tobacco, I mean, tobacco was a central crop in our nation's founding. Our nation's fathers did not die of lung cancer. They were using tobacco in very different ways. I mean, maybe it wasn't healthy, but they were using it in a very different way. And since the Industrial Revolution, we learned to use cigarettes, and we learned to consume a lot in a short amount of time. We had that on top of a mass marketing, political, marketing, social movement to make cigarettes look really cool. And you put those things together and you have the largest cause of preventable death, more than any war we've ever had, more than any shooting, gun issue, more than any of that, more than heart disease, more than obesity, more than diabetes, it comes from our legal drugs like tobacco. And it's a very deadly combination, but it came because public health failed, we did not recognize this as an issue, and the industry captured the conversation. That's my worry currently with marijuana. I repeat, my worry is not about adults smoking a joint. My worry is about this industry capture, which is showing young people, especially, who are the future customers, that this is fine. Many of you have heard of Juul, the e-cigarette company. That's actually a marijuana company. That's how it started. I mean, I won't go through the whole timeline here, but that's exactly how it started. It started as a marijuana company, Plume, and then it became Pax, and then it went off to Juul. And that's not surprising. If you look at the largest tobacco companies in the country, they have all invested in, not all, most, in marijuana. So Altria, Philip Morris, who brought Marlboro and a lot of other things, they've invested billions. So again, it's about money. It's about addiction for profit. It's definitely not about social justice, which I'll talk about at the end. That's how it's being sold, which is incredible to me. It's like guys that have never cared about social justice in their life, all of a sudden throwing a button on saying equal rights for all, legalize marijuana. It's like, well, wait a minute. And they're sadly hijacking that entire legitimate conversation about economic opportunities for poor people, but they're hijacking it for their own benefit, to legalize marijuana. And so you can look at article after article, report after report, and you have major investments in the marijuana and alcohol as well. I mean, they're not immune either. The alcohol companies see that alcohol use generally is declining. There are fewer people drinking now than there have been really in about 50 years. There's other things we're using, and there's also a wellness sort of push. And there's also studies debunking any of those old studies saying that moderate alcohol use was good for you. All of those studies are wrong. In the 90s, I grew up thinking moderate alcohol use was good for you. 2 glasses of wine. All of those studies have been totally debunked now. And half of them are funded by big alcohol. Anyhow, they're all getting involved in the marijuana industry because why not? They're hopping on the bandwagon. They need also other product lines. That's what they want to do. But they're all following, and the marijuana industry is following the tobacco playbook. The tobacco playbook had 4 or 5 main themes. I listed the first theme here. The other ones, you can guess what those themes are based on the pictures. Pictures worth 1,000 words. This first theme is it's medicine. We treated tobacco like medicine in the early days, if you can believe it. Cigarettes were medicine for some people. We had asthma cigarettes, by the way. Dr. Batty's, you can look it up, asthma cigarettes, right? can't even say it with a straight face. But convince people it's good for you. It's not only not bad for you, it's good for you. Here's a health cigar by our physicians, which they're they're recommending who want to regain or keep physical fitness. And so that's what they're doing. And I did have to add the Lucy and Desi here, also in Jamestown, or in the Chautauqua County. But celebrities, and it's not about them. It's just that was the thing to do. That was, no one was told these things were harmful, even though we actually had evidence it was harmful, and that evidence was being completely suppressed by the business. Of course it is. Businesses aren't in the business of telling you the bad part of their business, right? United Airlines doesn't have a press conference once a year to remind people that there is a slight chance we could crash into the ocean, right? They don't do that. Coca-Cola doesn't have a press conference to talk about sugar. And Hershey's doesn't do that. So it's not surprising that they don't do that. You don't do that. But this one was about getting celebrities. How many celebrities? And it was all Jackie Robinson, all kinds of celebrities. It was, that's Frank Gifford, by the way. And, it was really about how can we get celebrities on board. And there's Jackie Robinson. And that was the other part of the playbook. The other part of the playbook is make it friendly to kids, kid-friendly. So you had Flintstones smoking cigarettes at the commercial break. At the commercial break of the Flintstones, which kids were watching, not of other ones. And you literally had babies and children advertising cigarettes, talking about the ABCs of smoking and how it's a family thing. And yes, sir, here's your baby. That's one of my favorite ones. It's a pack of cool cigarettes. That's your baby right there. The snowman. It was totally acceptable to do that. It was all about that, and then the sex appeal, and young people, fun. The things you could say 20 years ago, breast implants for men. The kinds of things that were being said. This is in the 80s, not that long ago. Most of us were alive then. That's the playbook, and it was about using sex appeal, humor, to attract young people, not to attract 70-year-old smokers. It's to attract new customers, because you always need new customers. And then the other part of their playbook, the free giveaways. Tons of free giveaways, paraphernalia, merchandise, the gear, all the things. This is all about, I know there's a gas station in the county, I think it's in this county, that gives is it this county? Yeah. You fill up your gas and you get a free sample. Marijuana cigarette. By the way, that is, where they stole that from? They didn't sell that from, they actually sold that from the crack dealers of the 1980s. Crack dealers did that. Crack was new in 1982. We had cocaine, we didn't have crack. Somebody figured out you could smoke it and it hits your brain a lot faster, but you can't smoke the powder. It doesn't work that way. So you had to bake it in the oven with baking soda. Baking soda and powder cocaine equals crack. And because you get it into rocks. And so you smoke the rock, it's like a crack of rock, and it gets to your brain a lot faster than powder cocaine. And nobody knew how to do that or what that was, and so you had to have free samples. It's like Costco, the free samples. You had to have free samples, and that's what happened. And the same thing with marijuana and the free samples as well. So we now have medical, you've all seen that, and all the medical stuff. I have no problem with the medicinal use of components of marijuana. There are components that are helpful for certain things, and I'm not denying that. What I have a problem with is the idea that we have a vote on marijuana as medicine, or the legislature votes on whether it should be medicine. We don't vote on medicine. I don't want politicians voting on the next vaccine. I want that to be done by science. I don't want politicians voting on the flu formulation for my 3-year-old, because if they do, the one that has the most money is going to win. And that's not necessarily the best one. So this idea that we are voting on medicine, whether you're a governor, a legislator, or even a voter, we are not, unless there are any biopharmacological experts in here, and maybe there are. But if you're not that, you shouldn't be determining what medicine is. So that's my problem with this thing about medicine. But again, it's following the tobacco playbook. Not only is it not bad for you, it is good for you. And you're able to do that. And then the other part of the playbook is the celebrity endorsement. I mean, these are the top grossing, basically, celebrities of this last 10, 15 years. And you get them together and you have them promote. It's Martha Stewart's potluck dinner party. You have them promote marijuana to all kinds of demographics. That it's about celebrity endorsement. This is a hockey, not NHL, the one below, and I always forget what it's called. But this is but it's a major stadium with kids and everything, and then you have marijuana advertising, Santa Claus, rainbows, Pac-Man, what looks like Care Bears, social media. It's literally people under 21 promoting this stuff too. None of these people in these photos are over 21. But we're not enforcing it. We're not doing anything about it. We're just following the same path as we have for tobacco. Sex appeal, it's the same thing. And, this is what we're kind of okay with. I mean, we're promoting this as a state. It's one thing to say we don't want to arrest people, we don't want to incarcerate. By the way, there's nobody in prison for marijuana. President Biden just did a federal pardon of marijuana. You heard about that? How many people were released from prison when he did that? Zero. Not one person. But it was symbolic, I get it, and it cleared the record of 6,500 people over the last 35 years that had marijuana on their record at all. I mean, that's how few people it was. It's not emptying our prisons. But it's one thing to talk about it like that, but let's not kid ourselves that that's what we're doing. We are promoting it, and we're doing the giveaways, and we're doing all of that. And it goes back to this addiction for profit model. The addiction for profit model follows something in public policy, econ, we call Pareto's rule. Pareto's rule says that basically 80% of the action is done by 20% of the actors. So if you look at, let's take airlines again, 80% of the miles flown on United Airlines, for example, 80% of the total miles flown are flown by 20% of the passengers. Does that make sense? The other 80% of the passengers are occasional flyers, and they divide the 20% of miles among them. Okay, so that's Pareto's rule, and we see that in addictive. In fact, with alcohol, it's very stark. 10% of the population, just 10%, 35 million people or so, are responsible for 75% of the revenue that alcohol makes. So they're in the business of promoting alcoholism. I mean, there's no other way to say it. That is their business. Those are their most important customers. And it's really a delicate balance when you have a deadly product, because you don't want to kill them off too early either. So it's kind of, and you got to get the new consumers too. That's why you go to universities, you promote it to young people. I mean, that's why you do that. That's why you promote sports events and things like that. I mean, Super Bowl commercials. The best ones are usually alcohol. The funniest ones are usually the alcohol ones. They spend the most money. They have the most at stake. And marijuana is the same thing. We've seen this in Colorado. Small percentage of people consume the vast majority of marijuana. It doesn't take everyone to have to do that. We've had poison call centers, explosion in poison control exposures in Colorado, in all the states. This is just 3 of them. These more than doubled after legalization. If you think you know what you're getting, I have people say, well, at least I know what I'm getting if I go to a dispensary. You do not know what you're getting at all. I guarantee you that. The states can't. They are not regulating pesticide, mold, bacteria. It's almost impossible for them to do so, folks. It's the reason why we have a federal Food and Drug Administration. We have an FDA, and it's not perfect, that's for sure, but it's a heck of a lot better than the alternative, which are underfunded, under-budgeted state bureaucrats, not trained in this at all of a sudden starting a new office of whatever to pretend that they're regulating something that they have no idea about. And that's what's happening now. And in my book, I interview former owners of labs in Colorado who admit to me that they basically had a deal going with the with the companies, where they would, kind of cook the books. And, oh, you want us to say that your thing is 10% THC? Sure, we'll say that. You want us to say that it's mold-free under a certain amount? Yeah, we'll do that. That's what was happening, because the oversight is very, very, very little. But the main reason this was pushed here, and I have a whole chapter on this, is this issue of social justice. The reality is, folks, when you put pot shops and promote addiction in poor communities, that's never social justice. These are actually two of my heroes. This is James and Charmaine Hayes. They've stopped any pot shops in Compton, California, which is where the word chronic comes from, which is slang for marijuana. It's where Snoop Dogg, I think that's his current name, where he comes from. He's changed his name a few times. That's where he's like the ambassador for marijuana, I would say, in the country. He comes from there. They said this is perpetuating social injustice by allowing the concentration of marijuana stores in our communities. It's not fair, because they're bearing the brunt of it, and they're right. And that's why it's so sad to me when I took the scenic route from Buffalo here earlier, not the freeway, and I'm going through Indian country, I don't remember which tribe it was, and you see like the 8 shabby pot dispensaries all next to each other, and there's also the liquor store, and I don't know if there was a payday loan or a dollar store there, but not exactly things that are lifting up communities. This is totally regressive. And let me tell you something, that community is not benefiting from the tax revenue of that, I guarantee you. In many ways they're not benefiting, but an indirect way is that there are costs to this, to their young people, when it comes to learning, when it comes to their futures. Forget about the driving and the immediate costs, but there are long-term costs. And this isn't going to be solving any social issues anytime soon. And New York has made it a point, the state, to promote minority involvement in marijuana. And first of all, I know a lot of people who are offended by that, because they say, wait a minute, you only want to promote minority businesses when you talk about marijuana? Why is that the only time this is talked about? This is not, like, that doesn't make sense. But the reality is, first of all, the arrest rates for marijuana in legal states are still disproportionate. So you're not getting rid of that, by the way. The prisons are not going down. The prisons are not being reduced because of marijuana. This is the state population, the prison population, and then when legalization was implemented. There's no difference. This is Colorado and DC, but this is because of what we talked about. People are not in prison for that. So you're not helping social justice in that way. Young people are more likely to be arrested in Colorado. Young black men are more likely to be arrested now than they were before. So something's going on there. It has nothing to do with marijuana. And we're not making millionaires in minority communities. And every major media outlet that's looked into this for more than 1 second comes to the same conclusion. Even Vice News, which is like the most pro-marijuana publication almost that you could find, has talked about this is being gamed. This whole system is being gamed. And people of color are not making money from this. And that was one of the reasons in Albany why they passed this. And I would argue not only are they not making money, they are hurting. The poorest, which are often people of color, are being hurt the most. And they're also being promised these grand promises of economic rejuvenation. If you bet your future city on an addictive substance, which by the way is already, if you weren't in this game 25 years ago, you're not making money. So, I mean, this idea that like these new people are going to come from nowhere and ex-convicts are going to go get loans from the bank and they're going to make all this money now, that's not happening at all. It's doomed to fail. And so this is what really gets to me, because this is how it was sold. At least be honest. Just say we want to legalize marijuana because a bunch of people want to use it. That's at least a little bit more honest than we want to legalize it because of social justice. It's really perverted, I think. In fact, these are the marijuana dispensaries in Denver. They're all in the poor communities. That's the concentration. This is Southern California. Compton is one little white, you can barely see it. That's not red or blue, but basically, the pink, it's literally, that actually is Compton. You can't even see it, it's so small. But the concentration are in places that have that are disproportionately minority populations, both licensed and unlicensed, because they have a lot of unlicensed stores, like New York City does. New York City has over 1,100 unlicensed marijuana stores. If you've been to New York City in the last couple of years, the entire smell of the city has changed. It never smelled that great, but it was a combination of trash and other things. But now it's just marijuana, if you've been there at all. If you don't smell marijuana on the streets of Manhattan, you notice it. Now I notice, like, wow, it doesn't smell like marijuana. Whoa, it's because it always does now. But it's not just the smell, it's the unlicensed shops that they have. And the NYPD, which, rebuilt the largest city, the most important city in the world, arguably, after 9/11, rebuilt it brilliantly, etc., safe. It's incredible how safe it can be, given how many people are there. But they cannot, it's too much for them. They cannot enforce it. So they have over 1,200 illegal stores that have popped up since legalization, and the state can't do anything about it. They don't know what to do. And that's because the underground market thrives, as I was saying, and the New York Times had a big article about it. It's getting worse, not better. This was California, but Wall Street Journal yesterday was talking about New York. And by the way, that's because cartels are really, they're diversified businesses. You need to understand that. They are not just dealing in drugs. They're dealing in human trafficking. They're dealing in a variety of things. In fact, one of the biggest drug cartels in Colombia, their revenues mainly come from illegal mining and logging. So mining and logging are legal, but there's obviously, if you're not doing it legally, then you're doing it illegally. And that's how they're making a lot of their money, most of their money. Not from drugs even, let alone marijuana. So we're not getting rid of any cartels. That's not happening. Oregon this is state after state. We're not selling and even if we were, it's problematic in my mind, but we're not even doing that. We have studies about if you're near marijuana dispensaries, that increases the likelihood of youth use. That's not surprising. If you're bombarded by them and you're passing them every day on your way to school, you're probably going to be influenced by it. That is not surprising. And the hospitalizations, it's not just addiction, it's the hospitalizations from the poisonings of the edibles a lot of times, because you don't realize how much THC it has, and 5-year-olds are eating gummy bears and it laced with THC. But beyond that, we're seeing something, for example, called cannabis hyperemesis syndrome. I don't know if anyone's heard of that. It's uncontrollable vomiting. And you can look it up, viewer beware on YouTube if you want, but it's all over now. And if you talk to any ER doctor, one of their biggest admittance is for this syndrome that never existed before about 10 years ago, called cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, the vomiting. And it's just incredible, the difference when you talk to them. And meanwhile, it's guys like this, these are 3 of the biggest marijuana executives in the country, they're laughing all the way to the bank. Does this look like social justice to you? That's my question. It's just, and for so many reasons, it's not. These guys it's a small number of people making money. It's not mom and pop farmers. It's not mom and pop storekeepers. It's not happening. And a lot of people think, oh, this is the next big thing. It's like, frozen yogurt or like a low carb store or something. It's a fad, and it's very, very difficult to get into it. There are multiple state exemptions from Clean Indoor Air Acts. So the anti-tobacco movement spent decades to make sure that the air we breathe inside this university is not filled with smoke. Or when you go to the mall, or when you go to the doctor's office, or hospital, believe it or not, or library, or wherever. And yet, for the marijuana industry in states like Colorado, they're peeling a lot of that back. They're saying, we want to open like a marijuana consumption lounge and like a hotel with a restaurant. And they are completely changing and going back on these laws. You have a former Big Pharma OxyContin CEO is now selling medical marijuana. And so it's just, I think we have a false dichotomy of either legalization or incarceration. You don't have to go to either of those extremes. Not that we're incarcerating anybody, but that's the perception. And, I get that we have legalized in New York, so we have to deal with it. But there are a lot of things you can do at the local level. Of course, as I mentioned, the majority of localities here have banned it. But even in places that haven't, there are things you can do with advertising restrictions, potency restrictions, and things like that. This is one of my favorite, it's a sad, funny, I don't know what you want to call it, quote from The Economist, prominent magazine. While laboratory animals are an expensive way of understanding the risks of cannabis use, North Americans come free. And we are the lab rats right now. Nowhere else in the world is doing anywhere near the extent that we are. I live in Canada half the year. They federally legalized, because it's still illegal federally here. They federally legalized there a couple years back. The way they did it, I'm not saying it was good, but it's a lot better than we're doing it here. And the culture is very different there. You don't feel it as much. It's not so extreme like it is here. And I think we're on this experiment that, our kids and us, we're basically we're the lab rats for the rest of the world. We have to understand that. The last thing I want to mention is that this isn't just about the legalization of marijuana. This is about the legalization, really, of all drugs, and I am concerned about that. Again, I don't want to incarcerate users. Addiction is a disease. We should not stigmatize people with it. All of that's true, but we see state after state or other localities now being tricked into essentially legalizing drugs. Oregon was told they can choose treatment over incarceration if they voted for something called Measure 110. I would have voted for it if I didn't know anything about it. But the reality of what it did was essentially legalize the possession of methamphetamine, fentanyl, and heroin overnight. Because basically all a cop could do was give you an 800 number to call and hope that you called it to get treatment. Or they could issue you a ticket for $100 that they could never enforce, and if you didn't pay it. Those are the two options. Well, what's happened 2 years later in Oregon, or 3 years later? What's happened is less than 1% of people are going to treatment. So it's not putting people into treatment, but it's legalizing drugs. We're seeing this movement for injection sites to set up spaces where people can legally inject any drug that they want, or even smoke any drug that they want. We're seeing the push to legalize psychedelics, as I mentioned earlier. That's a whole other lecture, but it's very similar themes. There could be some medicinal therapeutic value, but it's being driven not by scientists, but this dialogue of psychedelics is being driven by really profiteers. And again, are we going to be fooled again is, I think, the big question. I live, like I said, mentioned more than half my time in Canada, specifically Vancouver, British Columbia. Universal health care, universal child care, very clean. If you visited Vancouver, beautiful place. But 5 minutes from the multi-million-dollar condos, literally a 5-minute walk. It's not. It's right there. You have one of the worst areas in North America for homelessness and addiction called the downtown East Side. And in the downtown East Side, you have drug user unions of people who actively use drugs and promote that, giving out pure heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, etc. And this is the way they think we should deal with drugs, by legalizing it, giving it to anyone who wants it. And you look at the data, we just have brand new data, April 13th, 2023. Canada is very good with data, unlike we are. We're like 2 years lag behind, but they're also smaller. They found out they had one OD event in British Columbia every 13 minutes. That's 30 per 100,000 population. That's 46 per 100,000 population. We're 30 per 100,000, and we have the worst epidemic we've ever had. My point in showing this is that it can get a lot worse for us. We have a 50% lower rate than they do of overdoses. I mean, it's hard to fathom because of how much fentanyl has changed the game here in America. But it can get worse if we do bad things. I mean, that's when you implement bad policy, you get bad outcomes. And I am very concerned about that, because we really need innovative solutions. We need drug courts. Drug courts is where you have a court with a therapeutic element to it, and you have those incentives I mentioned earlier. We need probation reform. Hawaii implemented probation reform 20 years ago, and they've had very, very good outcomes. Other places have replicated it. It essentially means that rather than sort of random and heavy enforcement, you have swift, certain, but modest penalties. And it shows that you can actually deter use with swift and certain penalties that are I use the analogy of a kid today, my child. If I tell my 3-year-old to clean her room or mess that she made, and if I tell her, if you don't clean your room or your mess, then there's a 50% chance that in 6 months I'm going to ground you for a year, she's probably not going to react very well. But if I say there's a 100% chance that you're not going to watch Daniel Tiger right now, which is a 20-minute cartoon, she'll respond to that because she can see that. And people with impulsive behavior, whether it's criminals or people with addictions, it's not about what's going to maybe happen in a year with a judge who finally hears the case, and then you're not going to deter a behavior that way that well. But if you have swift and certain sanctions, they don't have to be heavy. That actually deters it very well. And so they redid their probation system entirely in Hawaii. And they said, if you're on probation, you're calling a phone number every day. And if your number comes up, you have to come within an hour to the station or to wherever and take a drug test. And if you're positive, you go to jail or you don't show up, you go to jail for 2 days the first time. If you're positive again, it's like elevated sanctions, but very modest. And basically, they didn't have more than instances of like more than 2 or 3 positives, but the vast majority, they had no positives. And they didn't give treatment to people, by the way. These were methamphetamine users. They stopped using methamphetamine because of that threat of something that was swift and certain. It did not have to be heavy-handed. South Dakota has had wild success in reducing drunk driving, doing the exact same thing. Basically, if you're convicted of a DWI, we know that you're going to get convicted probably again, but to prevent that, you have to come, if you are randomly called, to take an alcohol test. And that has been very successful. Texas, they were going to build a new prison and spend $500 million doing so. Instead, they tried to pay half of that on re-entry programs to reduce the prison population. That innovation prevented them from building a new prison. So there are many ways we can reduce incarceration, we can reduce addiction, we can reduce all of these burdens on our systems without, I would say, normalizing and commercializing and legalizing drugs. And I hope we learn. There are multiple solutions. We need prevention, which I should talk about for sure. We need intervention and treatment. We need recovery. There are 23 million people in recovery in this country that are examples of you can overcome this. And by the way, addiction is the only disease that you're a better person after you recover than you were before you had it. It's amazing. So these are 23 million incredible people with hope. They serve as that example to people that you can recover. Smart enforcement and international efforts as well. This is an international problem. This is a global problem. I mean, look at fentanyl. We do not have good global cooperation. I'm not blaming one party or another, but we are paying that price too. We have horrible cooperation with our neighbors to the south, which also represent almost a failed state. But on our side, there's so much more we can be doing. We don't have good cooperation with other world superpowers for many reasons, and we're paying a price for all of this. And we don't have good prevention, as I mentioned. We don't have comprehensive prevention. We have little programs here and there, and they're important, but we don't have the comprehensive prevention that we need. So, and treatment. We need to make treatment a lot easier to get. Treatment's too hard to get, number one. And number two, because denial is the hallmark of this disease, we are often waiting for people. It's not so much wait lists for treatment as it is waiting for people to realize they have a problem. So we have to figure out ways to get people there so that they realize they have a problem. And right now, especially in a lot of our major cities, we've just said, we hope they don't overdose, and if they do, we'll give them Narcan. That's our strategy. We hope they don't overdose. We hope they one day decide to go to treatment. But we hope that if they do overdose, someone has Narcan for them. That's no wonder the addiction numbers are going up, 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 up every year, every month. Because that's not a long-term strategy. That is a little Band-Aid, and it's not a solution. But there are solutions. There are things that do work. I mentioned a few of them today, and we need to keep promoting those things. And on the marijuana side, I get that that's our state policy. We need to work to try and reduce the industry influence, try and learn from our past mistakes. Happy to answer any questions afterwards. Our website, one of our websites is here, learnaboutsam.org. My email address is there if you want to contact me. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.